Let's go.
Get your copy of Fire. It's definitely a must-read. If you enjoy hood books, this one is it. Just like the title of the book, it's officially Fire. Get it on Amazon, paperback or Kindle.
South Bangers production.
Peace. This is The Enemy's Public, and I am Bro.Nasir. This message is for our young people. It's not a message of being critical of our young people. It is a message of encouragement. Our enemies know who you are, young brothers and sisters. And that's what they are afraid of. They see your strength. They see your rebelliousness. They see your willingness to fight. This is why so many obstacles and distractions are implemented. This is why certain behaviors are socialized. Behaviors that are dangerous to us as a people, behaviors that are serving to our detriment, behavior that doesn't cause the reproduction of such young people, if you know what I mean. If illicit, promiscuous sexual behavior is encouraged through socialization, music, television, and other forms of entertainment, it takes the focus off what's really important. It takes the focus off our open and consistent enemy. It takes the focus off the fight in its entirety. Peace to A0 424. Thank you for tapping in. I really appreciate it. Again, it takes the focus off the fight in its entirety. People who are charged with teaching our children are teaching them socialization, indoctrination, and a total false narrative and history of who they are. Nothing we learn in America's school system gives us esteem. I don't want to use the P word because that word has been corrupted. Today's so-called educators can barely hold a student long enough to even teach them what America has to offer in learning. Our young people are not interested in an education that tells us we were in captivity. We went through Jim Crow, the civil rights era, And now we're hip hopping together. Our children don't want to learn that. Our history is far more greater than that. What was stolen from our people, such as patents and inventions, essential things that we use to this day on a daily basis, shows our greatness. If our people, our young people in particular, understood that there's a system that works against them and that it would take our undying love and unity and organizing with seriousness, we can change our dynamic and our condition overnight if we realize that we are not each other's enemies and we are brothers and sisters. We'll know that our change is our responsibility and not of a politician. We don't have to go to the polls to effect change. We must change what we do and how we relate and treat each other to effect change. I've said it before. We must develop a nervous system among our people, meaning that when something happens to one of us, we all feel it. The pain and suffering of one of us affects us all. We must love each other enough to not only stand, but to act on each other's behalf. If our enemies knew that we really, without a doubt, love each other, they'll change how they treat us. Because there'll be dire consequences to mistreating or doing one of us harm. Our enemies don't see this. If all we do is cry at the pain and suffering of our people, then they can predetermine what we're going to do when they harm us. Who cares about a crier with no action? Who cares about a march with no action or consequences being rendered? We'll just go to their brothers, the court, and expect their brothers to do something about their behavior. Some of our own people are wrapped up in this system. They are career driven and will not jeopardize their aspirations or career by doing the right thing. When that LAPD cop punched the brother in the face while he was handcuffed, the so-called brother cop didn't check his behavior. If there was no cameras around, that Negro would have helped him cover up that. If there was no cameras around, he'd have helped them cover that up, because their loyalty is to that blue line of silence. Our enemies are very afraid of our young people, not how they are, but their potential. They know our young people are waking up. They see the system for what it is. They see the hypocrisy of those that they put before us to represent us, and they are not accepting it. They're fight ready, but not organized. This, to me, is the best generation that we've produced. They know it, yet this generation doesn't know this of themselves. Yet sometimes the aspirations interfere with their potential, especially when athletes and other forms of entertainers are put before them as an influence. Then there's the school to prison pipeline. I'm sure by now most of us are familiar with this term. Yet how many of us are affected by its reality? Instead of the guidance counselors getting involved when a student is not behaving and being disruptive in class, instead of the vice principal getting involved, the dean, or calling the parents. They call the police. They call the police to handle an issue that has nothing to do with a crime. And what's crazy about that is they criminalize children today for something that we all done as a child. Then the one who responded as a school resource officer was probably the worst behaved student of them all. It's not in a cop's expertise to handle unruly students. It's the same with cops dealing with, mental health issues. They're not qualified. They barely know their job as a law enforcement officer and don't want to be reminded of what their job is either. Now, there are several traps set for our young people today. Several. Some in socialization, some dealing with law, some dealing with medical, some dealing with food. Our young people, in my sentiment, they can trip the trap, but don't get caught in the trap. Again, these young people today are the best generation we produce. There's several obstacles and traps to prevent them from being who they are, what their purpose is, and who and what their enemies are. The Kumbaya doctrine is a weapon of mass distraction, telling our people about this so-called rainbow coalition, this made for TV life that some of our young people believe. That's a non-reality. Now, I'm not saying that socialization is bad, but when you socialize things that's serving to our detriment, that's bad. When you take things that is supposed to be private as an adult and socialize it, that's bad. And that's not teaching correctly. Now, I have videos of the school to prison pipeline, and there were judges who were actually taking money to put children in jail. There were children thrown in jail, not for fighting, not for being disruptive, but for watching a fight. They got put in jail for watching a fight when there were probably adults, teachers, people who are responsible for children that was watching the fight, and they were not held accountable for what they've done. Now, I'm going to share my screen. We're going to get familiar what the school to prison pipeline is.
That you might hear in the news sometimes. The school to prison pipeline. It's shorthand for how schools are funneling students, especially Black students, into the criminal justice system. It started in the 90s when schools responded to fears about crime with zero tolerance policies, which mandated suspensions and expulsions for certain violations. They also cracked down on little things like talking back or uniform violations. The hope was that it would keep bigger problems from bubbling up. But as a result, out-of-school suspensions have doubled since the 1970s, and they keep increasing even though juvenile crime rates have now been dropping for years. Around the same time, the number of police officers stationed full-time inside schools has increased by a third between 1997 and 2007. Ostensibly, they were there to prevent mass school shootings like the one at Columbine. but they end up being a way for schools to basically outsource discipline to the police. Schools with officers have 5 times as many arrests for disorderly conduct as schools with.
What's crazy about that is it's not our children shooting up schools, but you will see the resource officers being overly aggressive to our children when it's not our children. Now, the narrative or the narrator of this video spoke about them trying to prevent shootings in a school, and she mentioned Columbine. Those were 2 white boys who went up into a school and shot up a school. Either they don't care about our schools, or there's no mass shootings in our school because they damn sure don't show it. But the only ones I see doing mass shootings in schools are Hispanics and white people, boys and girls.
Without them. Sometimes the results are shocking. But the less visible effect is that schools are feeding the racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Consider the fact that schools are more likely to have an officer on their campus if the student population is more than 50% Black. You might assume that that's because there's more crime at these schools, but although students at police schools are more likely to be arrested, they're not actually more likely to be charged in court for weapons, drugs, alcohol, or assault, at least according to one study. During the 2010-2011 school year, 1 in 6 public school students in the US were Black, but they accounted for 1 in 3 arrests at school. Same goes for other forms of school discipline. Black students are suspended or expelled 3 times more frequently than white students. It actually begins in preschool. 18% of preschoolers are Black. But if all preschoolers suspended more than once, 48% are Black. Studies show that differences in behavior can't fully account for these disparities. Black students and white students are sent to the principal's office at similar rates, but Black students are more likely to end up with a serious punishment. One study found that white students are more likely to be suspended for provable offenses like smoking or vandalism. Black students are more likely to be suspended for subjective offenses like talking back or insubordination.
Now, the talking back and the insubordination, especially in today's time, because a lot of children, our children in particular, have their hands on the pulse of what's going on, and they have information at their fingertips, and they can do research and find out the truth contrary to what they're being taught in the schools. And what they're doing, they're challenging the teacher and the curriculum in the classroom. Now, that's the insubordination and the talking back that our children are doing in these classrooms.
Students who are suspended in school are more likely to later drop out or get arrested. So the federal government is asking schools to make suspension and expulsion the absolute last resort. In Oakland, California, public schools are trying something called restorative justice, where both parties in a conflict talk it out with a counselor instead of relying on punishment. The results are pretty encouraging. In the last 10 years, chronic absenteeism is down and graduation rates are up in the schools that have tried it. Other cities and districts are also trying new policies. They're hoping that if their students end up in the criminal justice system, at least it won't be because the schools pushed them there.
Going to move on to the award-winning documentary, breaks down the preschool prison to pipeline, which is crazy, preschool.
The age of students being diverted from the school to prison pipeline getting younger and younger, leading to disturbing scenes like this one of a preschool student being taken into police custody.
Okay, she's gonna have to come with us now.
Okay, Kai, you gotta go with them.
See, some of these cops think they're doing something by using these scare tactics on small children, and they traumatize them. And what's crazy about this looks like a brother who's actually doing this to a child.
Them baby girl.
Kaya appeared
More than likely, a child that looks like us, one of our children.
not to understand what the police officers were doing.
Where are those for? No, no, I wanted to die. No, I was in school. I just saw you. No.
Why do he have the even heart to do that? To see the child crying and see the child that upset. Why do he have the heart to actually do this?
When children are in crisis, you don't call in a police officer to make it worse. What you do is you call into your support staff. You call into the nurse, you call into the social worker, the school counselor, the school psychologist.
An award-winning documentary breaks down the preschool to prison pipeline. And joining us this morning is the director and producer of the film, Dr. Karen Baptiste. Good morning, Dr. Baptiste.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, it is so hard to watch that. How old was that child, first of all?
6.
6 years old.
And she probably didn't even fully turn 6. She was in kindergarten, so that's 5, 6.
Oh my goodness. So as a teacher in the Bronx, you actually witnessed this firsthand, this prison or this preschool to prison pipeline.
Yes.
How old are the youngest kids then that actually get suspended? And where do you see this leading to down the road?
Kids as young as 3 and 4 are being suspended and even expelled, having handcuffs placed on them. As you saw in that footage, Kyle was taken to the police station, and everything that we teach our children about don't talk to strangers and protecting them. Not a single adult in that building went to the police station with her. She was put in handcuffs and sent with a male alone in a squad car, and even taken to a police station and had her mugshot taken.
Wow.
Oh my
That
gosh.
is
For crying hysterically on the carpet.
Oh my goodness. So let's talk about just the fact that you're talking about police, right? It's a big topic in schools. Police
Yes.
becoming more and more visible in schools. Some are for it, some are against it.
Right.
Where do you kind of see this going? Is there an alternative to keeping kids safe?
Absolutely. Right. And so at the end of the day, we all want children to be safe, right? We want educators to be safe as well. It's knowing when do you need to involve law enforcement. This is really about utilizing the resources of law enforcement when it's.
The police should not be in a classroom because a child is unruly. It should be the vice principal, dean, guidance counselor. If that don't work, you inconvenience the parent and call the parent. Had the parent, a parent's going to be upset if they got to leave work to come deal with their child because their child's not behaving in class. So that's the line you should do. This should never happen where a police officer, because a young lady won't put her cell phone away, he flips her out her desk and drag her across the floor in front of the whole class and take her into custody. This is wrong.
It's not necessary. School matters that are now becoming a police matter. So children crying on the carpet where it's uncontrollable, you don't need to call in a police officer. We're actually wasting resources of police officers when we're calling them in because they're not trained to deal with.
The police are a waste of taxpayers' dollars altogether. They're a waste of taxpayer dollars. We pay them to abuse us as young as 3 and 4 years old, our people. And of course, if they're in a school where they don't like the children, they despise the children that's in the school, they're going to mistreat the children.
With a child in crisis. So when you look at the school system, what we need to do with our.
Salute to my Jersey brethren. Warfare K, thanks for tapping in. Peace and power.
Teachers is actually retrain and get school social workers, psychologists, counselors, nurses. That's what we need to bring in and ensure that people are equipped of how to identify.
That's not the answer, what we see on the video.
To teach, it should never be to punish the child and to be so harsh with this and call in a police officer.
And I feel like this immediately destroys any kind of a potential relationship, good relationship between police and children. Right?
Yes,
it really
absolutely.
Does. But let me ask you this specifically, though. So zero tolerance policies combined with implicit bias, they play a big part.
What's crazy about that, they be so critical and so abusive to our children. Meanwhile, the little white boy and sometimes the white girl is planning a mass shooting in the school, not watching them, but paying so much attention to a child that's being disruptive. I'm not saying I don't make an excuse for a child being disruptive in class, but that's not how you handle it. Become violent and commit a violent act on a child because they defy you, they sass you. And then if this little girl's father did that to her, the cop will come and arrest him for it, but he think he has the right to do it. That's madness.
Also,
Yes.
can you explain that?
Absolutely. Everyone has implicit bias. Everyone has, and bias inherently is not a bad thing. Bias becomes problematic based on what we do with that bias that we have. And what we're finding in the education system is that they come in with this bias. They are not trained to even acknowledge the bias and then how it plays out in their behavior. There was a 2016 Yale Student Center report done, right, where they had these teachers go in and they told them to sit at this computer and they used this eye tracking software. And they said, we're going to show you videos of children and we want you to track the students who are misbehaving. Black teachers, white teachers, brown teachers all tracked Black boys.
Wow.
And they did not know that it was tracking their eyes.
Wow.
And that's what they found. And so this is the type of training and support that is needed in teacher prep programs, leadership prep programs, where it's.
This means that some of us have our own, have biases towards our own. They will look at the young brother who is probably behaving in school, trying to get good grades, and, you know, is outstanding student. Yet they're looking at him to be expected to be disruptive and not behave in school. Not looking at the ones who actually don't, because it's in the statistics, the ones who more than likely to commit vandalism, smoking, and all that are white children, not Black children.
We just acknowledge what is the bias that I have. And oftentimes people don't walk around thinking about daily what their bias is.
Yeah,
right?
and then on the flip side of everything, on the back end, there's the whole thing that happens after somebody is taken into custody, right? There's the whole sentencing process that plays out. Your documentary highlighting that as well.
It does. Yes. And so that number, right, when you look at Black students represent 18% of the.
They actually shot a mug shot of a preschooler. A preschooler has a mug shot. They should be ashamed of themselves.
Population in school, but they account for 43% of the arrests in school. So there's a huge disproportionality when we start talking about arrests. When we look at children with disabilities as well, this is not just happening to children of color. This also happens to white children, children with disabilities. We have 1.5 million approximately preschoolers in this country, and 7% of that population is students with special needs. However, they account for 2.5 times the amount of suspensions and even arrests than their non-disabled peers.
Yes. Wow. Some of your findings are so upsetting and disturbing, but hopefully it will lead to positive change.
Yes.
So we appreciate you being here this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And you can actually have there's screenings as well.
Screening this Sunday for the Bushwick Film Festival. We had our red carpet premiere last night. So Sunday at 3:45 at the Williamsburg Cinema in Williamsburg, Brooklyn.
Gotcha.
Wonderful.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much.
The next video is how schools are funneling Black students into the prison, the school to prison pipeline.
America's public schools are failing students in multiple ways. One of the most disruptive is the process by which students are funneled out of public schools and into the juvenile justice system. It's called the school to prison pipeline, and there is increasing evidence that it starts as early as preschool. The school to prison pipeline primarily victimizes Black students, trapping them in a cycle of incarceration.
I want to believe that every student wants to overcome the societal predictions of what's placed on them because of their race, sex, and their socioeconomic status.
Increasingly, schools are cracking down on small offenses.
Peace and power to my good brother, Keith Norfolk, the Nation One Love podcast. Peace and power.
Such as cutting classes or being disrespectful. This is supposed to discourage more serious infractions like drug or weapons possession. But what
Peace and power to my brother, Big Dog Philly OG. Peace.
Constitutes as disobedience or disrespect can be very subjective. A study in Texas found that 97% of the state's suspensions were made for subjective reasons, made at the discretion of school administrators, and Black students were 31%.
Subjective discipline, which is crazy. That means, and especially if it's at the discretion of the faculty and staff of what happened to the student can be challenging the information that the teacher is giving, because especially today, these children have phones, they have computers, and they can research and find information that's contrary to what they're being taught. And if they defy the teacher and the curriculum, that's called, being disruptive. And, and that's what they're talking about when they're talking about the insubordination in the school. It's just challenging and questioning what they're being taught.
% more likely to receive discretionary suspensions than white students.
It obviously affects the individual who is actually entering the penal system, but you're affecting communities, you're affecting the economy, you're affecting families, you're affecting school systems.
Disparity can start as early as preschool, when 48% of preschoolers who are suspended more than once are Black. African American boys are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white counterparts. And Black.
I'm going to tell you, young Black boys should not be taught by especially white women, because they're going to classify them. They're going to want to keep the boy from being a young man. They want him to sit still while they do a boring lesson, when they can't even gravitate the students towards what they're teaching. It's not a learning problem. It's a teaching problem. They don't know how to teach, and they don't know what to teach these students.
Black girls are suspended at higher rates than any other race.
I want to believe every student is destined for success. They want to achieve, but more times now we can't control certain things what happen in their homes. I had a student years ago, by the time they got to school, they said, hey, I walked through a crack house facility, prostitution. When I get here, I walk through a metal detector and people bother me. And I haven't eaten since lunch yesterday. And you're asking me to sit here in class and learn? There's a challenge.
When students are kept out of school as punishment, they miss lessons and assignment and fall behind academically. They are more likely to be disciplined again, which can lead to
And nowadays, you see this young sister's hair, and nowadays they are sending students home. They are depriving students, boys and girls, of an education, even though it's not worth the paper that the books are printed on. They are sending our children home and depriving them of an education because of the style of their hair. They look at a student and look at their hair, and they can't participate in sports events. They can't even sit at their desk and learn because the style of their hair. Not being disruptive, but wearing a certain hairstyle prohibits them from being educated.
Further problems. The Texas study found that students who had been suspended or expelled were twice as likely to drop out. Adding to the problem, police officers stationed inside schools. When these officers react overzealously to minor infractions, they make small problems worse. Schools with officers have 5 times as many.
Now that cop that flipped that girl out of her desk, he need more than a talking to. He need his ass kicked for that. He need his ass kicked.
Any arrest for disorderly conduct as schools without them. All 25 of the nation's largest school districts have sworn police officers in at least some schools. As widespread protests emerged after George Floyd's death in police custody, Minneapolis School Board voted unanimously to end its contract with the police department. And there is pressure from students, educators, and activists around the country for other school districts to do the same. And there are other solutions as well.
We need more of our educators to take a genuine interest in the whole student, as opposed to what they're going to teach on the board and so forth. Do not be quick to actually discipline them, but be more mindful of the predicament.
The teachers are impatient, and they are really there for a paycheck. You can see it today, especially when that bell ring, they beat the students out of the school, run into their car to get away from the students. They just there to collect the paycheck. They're not dedicated teachers. I'm not saying that there's not any dedicated teachers, but if there's a school to prison pipeline, it's self-explanatory. They don't want to teach. When they're challenged as a teacher, they should step their game up as a teacher, not feel like they're supposed to punish a student for challenging what they're being taught.
When they may be coming from and have an understanding of why they're doing what they're doing. Now, I'm not saying take away the discipline, but as you're adding that disciplinary act or that consequence, you're explaining why am I.
The police should not be a part of any discipline in a school at all. Unless there's a crime being committed, the police belongs out the classroom. They are supposed to be like the surveillance cameras, just in case. That's what they're supposed to be for. Just in case a crime is committed, they're on deck to handle it. Other than that, they shouldn't be calling to no classroom because a child won't behave.
Doing this, you're explaining the reason I am disciplining you is because this happened, and this is how you can fix this down the line. I'm showing a genuine interest of actually being restorative and helping you and moving forward so this won't happen again and be repeated.
There are also proactive solutions, including hiring school guidance counselors instead of police officers. Experts say the best way to prevent incarceration is to provide more equal educational opportunities and to create environments that support all students.
Now we're going to go to why race matters, the school to prison pipeline, because it does.
According to the Madison School District, "57% of school suspensions in 2019 were given to Black students. Why is that? Large education gaps, poverty levels, and zero tolerance policies are huge issues that affect Black education in Wisconsin. Today, we'll talk to one survivor of the school to prison pipeline and how they're using their story to help Black youth in Wisconsin. But first, let's explore why race matters when we talk about education.
The landmark 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case declared that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Even then, it wasn't until 1976 that federal Judge John Reynolds issued a court order to desegregate Milwaukee's public schools. However, Black students are still segregated by school policies. The 1990s saw ineffective zero tolerance policies that led to the hypercriminalization of Black students. Yet school districts still pushed for extra precautions. In 2007, Milwaukee Public Schools brought police officers, known as school resource officers or SROs, to their district, which led to an increase in school arrests and citations. In Madison Metropolitan School District,
they are arresting students for unruly behavior and giving them citations. Like they're on the streets. The police should be patrolling the area in the event that they're needed if a crime's being committed in the school. I can see a fight, yet they shouldn't be the first line of defense. In a fight, it should be the security that works in the school. That should be the first line of defense. And if somebody have to be arrested, the security detain the student, and depending on the severity of the situation. If somebody has to be arrested, then you bring the police in. But you don't automatically send a cop into a classroom, especially when some of these cops are impatient. They resort to violence in a matter of seconds. And then they end up assaulting a child in a school. And what parent want to hear anything that cop got to say if they do what some of these cops do to these students in school? That makes something simple as a little school fight that escalates it to a father wanting to beat up the resource officer. Period.
Black students made up 81% of citations and 64% of arrests made by police between 2019 and 2020. Organizers and activists like Rudy Bankston worked tirelessly to address the criminalization of Black students and the pipeline between schools and the criminal justice system.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Rudy.
Thank you for reaching out and inviting me.
Of course. We feel like you have a lot to share on this topic. So to get us started, though, you tell us your story and how it has landed you in the field, in the area of work that you're in.
I grew up in Milwaukee, the youngest of four. Grew up on the north side of Milwaukee. And this is the 80s and 90s. And attended public education. A lot of busing was happening back then. So
that means students being bused to other schools outside their neighborhood?
Yeah, predominantly white communities. And there's a wooded area. So it was the school, it was a parking lot, and it was like 2-3 blocks of wooded area where folks would go, students would go hang out. We would sneak out during lunch and just kick it a little bit. Sometimes skip, sometimes just hang out after school in there because it was just a place where folks went in, students went and hung out. And one day, there was a group of us in the wooded area with a fake gun, and it was not the serious looking gun, fake guns today. It was like a real fake gun. The next day, I think it was, sitting in the classroom, and a security guard come get me in the classroom, pull me out and say, hey, started talking to me about a gun. And I don't know what the hell he's talking about, because his tone was like a real gun. I'm not even drawing a connection to when we were kicking it in the woods. I'm not drawing any connection. So I didn't realize what they were talking about till I got into the principal's office, and 2 police officers are in there. And they throw me in handcuffs, tell me the details. I say, listen, that's a fake gun. I told them where it was at. It was at home. I told them where it was at. They put me in handcuffs and took me away and locked me up in the detention center. They expelled me from the school.
Wait. So this is over allegations around a toy gun that was in the woods of your school. That you were arrested and expelled?
Yeah, expelled immediately. No, and I was expelled and I was placed in an alternative.
Zero tolerance for the Black students, yet the white students get a slap on the wrist, and they end up bringing real guns into the schools and killing students and teachers. Incredible.
I spent maybe 2-3 days in the detention center in this alternative school, where alternative schools in Milwaukee at that time, you had some folks who were really trying, but they were under-resourced, and they were seeing some of the worst teachers. And maybe not worse, but teachers with the poorest records. That became my new peer group, and it spilled over. We kicked it. We started hanging out but this became my new peer group. Meanwhile, my mother working full time. But by the time I was 18 years old, I was arrested for first-degree intentional homicide, party to the crime, first-degree reckless endangering the safety, party to the crime. This was during the OJ trial, when I was going to trial. And I was just really understanding a lot more about race and whatnot. But I had 2 trials. First trial ended in a mistrial. Second trial, I had an all-white jury. And it was and again, this was at the height of the O.J. Simpson trial and the racial divide that was being exposed, not new, but exposed. And I recall one of the jurors was trying to exclude herself from doing, and the judge asked why. She said, I was on a highway one day and I cut off this group of black guys, and I cut them off, and I think she said she gave them the finger, and they caught up with her and like threw a soda out the window and it splattered off. She's like graphic, and all the people on the jury in the jury pool, they're like looking all sad and like sympathizing. And then she was like, and they never got caught. And it felt like in that moment, they looked that the energy was like, this one won't get away though. You know what I mean? So I'm there paranoid. I'm like, man, this is it, you know. So meanwhile, I get found guilty. And I always say I'm not innocent in terms of, like, I fell off into the streets. You talking about the 90s in Milwaukee, like, you know what I mean? But I was not guilty of this particular case. While in prison, I began to educate myself. My cell truly became a classroom. I ordered books, and I can say it now, but we can only have a limit on books in prison. So I started building libraries in the other guy's cell that didn't read, and just had my people send them books.
Wait, what was the maximum of books you were
25 publications. Through that reading, I started to really discover how resilient and beautiful and how much genius Black people hold. And growing up in education, I always got the slave story.
That's why I said our enemies know who our young people are. Our young people are the ones who are war ready, and they don't have the discipline. Yet that's changing. And that's what our enemies are afraid of. That's why a school to prison pipeline is set up to be an obstacle, to be a hurdle. School to prison pipeline, sometimes it can be over minor offenses. They'll send you to jail over a minor offense just to have you in the system. The system is real easy to get in, but hard to get out.
Right.
But even with that slave story, I got this as victims. And like knowledge became like it became like innate, like this is a part of who we are. You know what I mean? And this is stuff I never learned. And again, even when we got to slavery, the story was different. Like how much genius and resilience it took to survive and even in some instances thrive when the world was set up to crush you and make you feel less than. I learned about why we went from Africans to Negroes. And when you rob people of their names, then you can define who they are. And so it was just so much stuff that I was learning during that time. And I began to really truly realize that our ignorance is weaponized against us. It helps you to
Well put. Our ignorance is weaponized against us. They count on us being ignorant. They count on us being self-destructive. And when we try to gain some traction by coming out of such behavior, they try to set up another trap and hurdle. And then they use, the kumbayaism as a distraction too.
To have this intimate relationship with your humanity. And when you know you're a human, you're not going to accept slavery or oppression. And it's similar to today. When we know what we're truly worth, we're not going to accept. So just that education piece became critical, but not a white-centered education.
I was going to say, because when people hear the word education, a certain idea comes to mind. The assumption is like, oh, well, we have education. But as you've already pointed out, like what type of education, what sort of messaging is that education communicating to Black students? And if it's reinforcing this negative narrative.
A curriculum of indoctrination, especially when it comes to the so-called history.
Then how is that going to make that student feel empowered in your classroom, right? So like, and stereotype threat is a thing. It's an absolute thing, right? How is that causing me to view myself in a way that is empowering, that I can then perform well? Or is it feeding these like defeatist victim mentalities to me? So I don't even think that I can. And I'm so hard trying to disprove this idea that I can't, that I'm underperforming. Right. So like, yeah, overhauling education and just confronting how we go about it. Like, absolutely. Like, who is it serving? And if it's not equally serving everyone, then what needs to change?
Like the prison system is a cemetery of some of the best talent in the world just sitting there. And a lot of these men will rediscover.
And that's exactly why they have a school to prison pipeline. That's why they have a system to stunt the growth of young people. It's a system, and a prison or a jail, whether it's in the county or the state or the feds, it's a mere empty shell of a building if there's no occupants. And then nobody gets paid if there's no occupants. Let's say people stop committing crimes and things that's considered a crime just for some, they just decriminalize some of the things they consider as crimes, things that people shouldn't really be going to jail over. They stop making those crimes. The jails would be a lot emptier than they are.
Writing and music and philosophy and just deep stuff.
Well, let me ask you this, because and thank you. Like, your story, I feel like you could get a movie, docuseries, something.
Make it happen. Let's get it.
I mean, we are a media company. I was like, I can't do that. Wait a minute.
Yes, you can.
we can talk about that.
No doubt.
But I'm thinking about like those who are listening to this and are thinking like, okay, we started off talking about like his time in school, and then we talked about your time within the criminal justice system. And I wanted to elevate why it's so important to talk about those two systems being connected.
Because the one feeds the other. My school to prison pipeline started in middle school when they said get out. That changed the trajectory of my life. When I got kicked out of that middle school and went to that alternative school, the streets became a part of like they said get out, and you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So that story started in middle school, as it often does with young people. Part of the work that I do also, not only I mainly work with adults and work with adults around race and racism and things. And it can be anything from curriculum to development to building just and equitable learning environments, but also contract with a part of one of my contracts is working with the young people in the juvenile system right here downtown in JRC. And I'm seeing the same thing in terms of like smart, gifted, in unique ways that don't fit the mold of, but like, and you just want to like, how do we pull these resources and get them what they need? Our young people spend more time in these schools.
Yes.
And their reality of themselves and the world is getting shaped. And education is like, it's always been. It's like a serious hit or miss. You don't show up with all the answers. You show up, you listen to the people, they give you all their thoughts, their wisdom jumbled all up. And your job as the revolutionary is to go and organize that knowledge and wisdom and give it back to the people. And I think that's the same relationship that has to be done with young people, where you have to show up expecting them to teach you some things. Because they're going to teach us like a parent and a child. That child is going to teach you how to be a father. You don't have to have all the answers. You just need to pay attention to and it's the same with education, but it's really difficult because if you're an educator and you're showing up with all this bias that society have, when you think about white supremacy culture, it's the air we breathe, the water we swim in. So we've all internalized that, but you show up in a classroom and you've not done any of your own identity work, and you're showing up with this, and then the district is constantly pounding data in your head about how Black kids cannot learn. And then they say go into class and change and teach Black kids. So you have to have some very deep and intentional unpacking.
And I feel like sometimes it's not even data that specifically says that,
It's
but
real
it's the
talk.
comparisons, right? So if you're saying, oh, that Black students are performing in this way by comparison to white students, that's setting up white students as the norm by which everyone else is then expected to level up with.
That's the very epitome of white supremacy. Because if you're the norm, you're the superior.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And if you're not learning in that dominant way, if you're not fitting into that cookie cutter approach to education, then that's how so many people end up in prison with such deep intelligence, but they may learn in unique ways. Again, people of color, specifically.
Exactly. It's not a learning problem, it's a teaching problem. People learn the way they learned.
Speaking for myself as a Black person, we internalize this stuff as well. So we have to continue to do our own work. The struggle is we're expected to do the work of teaching white folks,
right,
and then also doing our own healing. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And that's been a consistent theme in all these conversations that I've had to date is that, like, there are folks like you who are in the field doing the work, but that doesn't absolve you from needing to, like, manage your own stuff. I mean, you've had like a super traumatic like experience for decades, like, so you're still having to deal with aspects of what that still means for you, on top of how you're pouring into other people and trying to fix like this corrupt system or systems. So yeah.
And the daily chipping away of micro traumas. I mean, I had to create space for myself because I was carrying a story of institutionalization. And for me, it freaked me out to start seeing the same fear that I saw in the prison system amongst staff who wanted to treat quote unquote inmates more humane, and how they would be scrutinized. And I show up in education, I did not get that level of fear. And it really shocked me, and not from a place of
Salute to my brother and comrade, Talk Your Talk Media, my brother Greedy Vegan. Salute. Thanks for tapping in, good brother.
judgment, but from a place of like, how is this living? But that is capitalistic white supremacy culture, where it thrives off of keeping people in place. Education is more about compliant than really helping students to become critical thinkers.
That's why the school resource officers fit right in, because you have a cop in the school. He really shouldn't be there. And it's about compliance, not questioning what you're being taught. A child could study something prior to going into the classroom, and they can see the hypocrisy in the teacher. They can see that what we're being taught is utter nonsense, and because they raise their hand, sometimes they can raise their hand and respectfully challenge what the teacher is being taught. Because if you have a parent that has some information and has some knowledge, and they tell you something contrary to what the teacher's trying to give you, 9 times out of 10, you're going to go with what your parent tell you. And so you're going to raise your hand and say, look, that's incorrect. You may not say it like that, but you're going to say it in the way, look, you're going to challenge them. And that's insubordination when you challenge somebody's, especially the curriculum. And they'll bring a resource officer in because you're being disruptive in class. No crime's been committed. So why do they have the resource officers handling things other than crimes?
And when you're focused on compliance, that stuff, it trickles down. So the principal is complying with the school district is complying with the board, and then the teachers feeling like they don't have power, so their classroom becomes their only place of power. So then now they have to get compliant, and that energy around that, it makes it extremely difficult to have like those just and equitable learning environments. So how can we make sure the well-being of everyone is centered, and how do we make that a part of the curriculum? Like, how do we turn that into lessons? Because one thing that
a lot of the information that they're giving our children as opposed to other students is culturally biased. They'll ask us something that don't even pertain to us and expect us to know the answer because it's not in our culture. If it's not in our culture, we're not gonna know nothing about it. If somebody grew up in the projects, you can't ask them about a picket fence with grass. No, you gotta ask them about a basketball court. You gotta ask them about concrete. You gotta ask them about, you know, they'll probably know a little something about a damn raid, a door being kicked in, but they don't know nothing about a picket fence and a swing in the backyard. They don't know nothing about that because that's not their experience.
George Floyd and all this other stuff that's happening, that's all curriculum. And it's what's in pack, it's what we carrying. So we can create healing environments that where education is anchored into the reality of what we're grappling with, but it's also led with hard work. But right, it's still that headiness head, and and it's folks are burnt out.
I love like everything as you just said,
Yeah.
and especially like the emphasis on how we can reimagine. Because there's been, since we've gone virtual, like there's been like little catchphrases about what's the reimagining of education and what's it going to look like that's different. And you're right, but it's catchphrasy to say that, but it's easier to default to what's familiar. So I feel like some folks are trying to transition, but that's hard to do when the system is structured in a very specific way that this is how education works. But I am seeing like more conversations about how are we centering social emotional needs and social and emotional learning such that we're not ignoring the realities of our students and our families and our staff in this point in history, on top of like, we got to figure out online learning. Oh yeah, and it's COVID. Oh yeah, and all the other things, right? We can't ignore like that human side of people, which you've already too talked about. So if we keep ignoring SEL, then that's not going to serve, right, those who were trying to
and
educate.
sell for not only students but adults.
Right, like we treat so like it's just
yeah, like it's for a community, but the threat to radically reimagining anything is the conditioning around going back to what you're familiar with. People would prefer a familiar slavery than an unfamiliar freedom because it's what
they know.
You know what I mean? Even though it's dysfunctional as hell,
there's comfort in that dysfunction because at least I know what it is.
Yeah. And that is the biggest threat. But that's the biggest threat to any real fundamental revolutionary change is you have to conquer that inclination to go to what you're familiar with, especially when what's familiar is not benefiting the whole community.
So again, you've highlighted the issues around school to prison pipeline. You gave your own personal story of how that started off. And I hope people understood that entry point and what that looked like and how it just escalated over time and then kind of how that culminated for you. But one of the things I did want to elevate, because you've mentioned men quite a few times, is the plight for Black girls in particular. And there are books like Pushed Out that are trying to call attention to, hey, there's this issue. But again, it's not being spoken about. So that's something you can speak to briefly before we close.
Thank you for elevating that. It's just, it's still that old belief that it's just the threat to Black males. But I'm in education. Black girls are being criminalized. It's an
damn sure are. They're being criminalized. They're being treated like criminals, and they're the same thing that happens to our young brothers are happening to our young sisters. And our young sisters share the same sentiment of our young brothers when it comes to the educational system and when it comes to this society as a whole. You can't tell them, that, you can't educate them in a way that don't give them esteem. You can't lie to them and they don't call it out. That's just not in these young people's nature. They're not built like that. They have information at their fingertips. I didn't have it at my fingertips. That's why I love books so much, because I always loved books. But today, If they got a very good internet and they got a good computer, whatever they want to know, if they're not intellectually lazy, they can find it out. All they gotta do is go to a search engine and put what they want to know in a search engine, and it's right there. And if they can comprehend what they read, that's a dangerous young man and woman. Period. If they can comprehend what they read, because anybody can read something, but if they're understanding what they're reading, they're going to always challenge those who are trying to teach them, especially when they're trying to indoctrinate them.
An adultification of Black girls. You can have, I've witnessed it, you can have a group of white female students running down the hall, and it's symbolic. And people wouldn't bat an eye. But you have a group of Black girls running down the hall, and it's just, ring the alarm. And that's symbolic. It's a small thing, but it's symbolic. But we have got, I work with our young sisters, particularly, we just had they're quarantining in JRC, and our last two students were black girls, struggling, like wanting to do good, wanting to do great things. But society is mean on our Black girls, and they are being made to feel that they are not smart enough, they're not pretty enough.
Yep.
And some of it happens within the family, some of it happens through media, some of it happens through school, but they internalize that. And there's a phenomenon in education where Black girls are fighting, and they don't understand where it's coming from. But what you internalize, you externalize, particularly on those who, if you've been made to feel like you're not pretty enough, you're not smart enough, and you begin to develop some stuff. And I'm not talking about all, because some of our little sisters is just like, they get it. But there are some of our little sisters, they're suffering in deep ways. And instead of folks asking what happened, they're asking what's wrong with you.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
It's like that lack of recognition around how trauma, however that's manifested, maybe contributing to what you're seeing in the classroom.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Just undermining their pain and suffering, asking them what's wrong with them. A lot of times, instead of talking, we should just listen.
And how that's then leading to other sorts of issues in school, which could then land you in the juvenile justice system, and that could just accelerate from there.
And to be treated as a young person, to be treated as an adult, or like treat young people like whole human beings, but give them space to develop. When you're made to believe, where people treat you as if what is happening in your life you deserve it, you begin to believe that, and then that just creates this spiral. But thank you for lifting that up and checking my patriarchy in the process, because it is, and I need that. But and it's not like I'm blind to it, because I see it. I've checked other people about it. When they say our black boys, no, our Black girls are suffering now. And it's about creating healing spaces for them, and allowing them, allowing them to co-create these spaces.
Like you said before, not coming in with the solutions and the hero cape on,
right,
but saying, what do you need, and what would you like to create that then provides what is it you need?
Yeah, for sure.
Wow. Well, thank you for speaking to that. Definitely didn't want that piece to go unnoticed.
Thank you. I needed that love.
Oh no, it's fine, because it's this weird kind of juxtaposition of like an invisible hyper visibility that I think Black women and Black girls in our state and our city like deal with on a regular basis. And constantly confronting that, I think, is what we want to take place here. So I feel like you've dropped so many nuggets just during our entire time together. So I don't want you to feel like you have to say something that's like a closeout. But if there's anything that you want people watching this to take away from, whether they can relate to your story or not, whether they're like, oh, this is like new information for me, I want to help, or like, I've been in this and I'm trying to move the needle and I'm just struggling, like what do you want them to connect with the most?
For me, anti-racism work is about tearing down the barriers that gets in the way of us seeing one another humanity.
Exactly.
And that work is critical during this time, whether you're an 80-year-old or you 8 years old. I think our mission is a onion mission where you're going to peel, you're going to peel, you're going to peel, and you're going to keep peeling because it's going to be lifelong work, whether regardless of what your race or your or sexuality or gender is. And sometimes that onion is going to make you cry. Like it's going to make you cry because right when you think you got it, and it's another thing shows up. And I'm speaking from experience, you know. So.
That is so true. This work is not a checklist. It's not checkbox work. It's like you said, it's lifelong, continuous commitment. Thank you for that, Rudy.
For sure.
Public education is just that, education for the public. The school-to-prison pipeline and other disparities within the education system can have huge negative effects on people of color, especially within the Black community. A lack of representation in classrooms, administrations, and on school boards is also an issue, one of a list of problems that need solutions. To hear more of Rudy's incredible journey, including how he won his freedom from incarceration, subscribe and listen to our podcast at pbswisconsin.org/Why Race Matters. There, you can also find links and resources.
Now we're going to go to how U.S. schools punish Black students, Black children. Continuing on the subject, the school to prison pipeline.
In September of 2019, a 6-year-old student named Kaya was sitting in her school's office.
Okay, she's gonna have to come with us now.
That's a police officer. This video comes from his body camera. At first, it seems like Kaya doesn't know what's happening.
Where are those for? No, I want it. Holy! Oh, I was in school like this fire.
Earlier that day, Kaya had
It's crazy.
a tantrum. 3 school employees said that she had kicked them. The school called the police, who arrested Kaya on charges.
Arresting a baby for something that most of us have done in the school. They called the police instead of calling the parents. Shameful.
Of misdemeanor battery.
I don't want to go to the police.
Shameful.
The police dropped the charges.
But they did this to scare the child, which is not good. It's not good to cause that type of scares and trauma to the child. It's not good. And it was crazy about that. It's a brother that's doing it. And he probably think he's doing something.
Kaya's grandmother sent this video to the Orlando Sentinel. Kaya's case isn't an isolated incident.
A 5-year-old girl being handcuffed by police in Florida.
For a year, he could not sleep alone.
He put handcuffs on me.
Tossed to the ground by a school resource officer.
What you're seeing are the
video with the little girl to the far right on the bottom is over milk. He did all this to this little girl over milk, and I can guarantee you for certain that he wouldn't do this to a little white girl. I'm going to say this. White cops have no business in our community policing on no level. From a child to the oldest adult in our community, they have no business having contact with us because they're not going to approach any of it with compassion. They never do.
the effects of a larger problem in American schools. The US doesn't treat all students equally. But if we wanted to, we could do something about that. The next president could decide if that happens. In 2016, researchers at Yale showed teachers this video clip of 4 preschool students. Their instructions: look for misbehavior and click when you see it. The study was kind of deceptive. None of the kids
Of course,
in
it
the
was
video
deceptive.
actually misbehaved. The researchers were using eye tracking software. What they actually wanted to study was who the teachers
Who the teacher looks
were
at.
watching. Both Black and white teachers spent significantly more time watching the Black boy in the video. This study showed that even preschool teachers can treat kids differently based on their race without even realizing it. Look elsewhere in the US school system, and you'll see this show up in other ways, like at this middle school in Bryan, Texas. They gave students tickets for offenses like disrupting class or using profanity. Black students were 4 times more likely than white students to receive those tickets. Nationwide, Black boys miss way more school due to suspensions than any other group. And this can start a kind of chain reaction. Missing weeks of school due to suspensions makes students much more likely to drop out. Without a diploma, you're much less likely to earn a living wage and much more likely to be incarcerated. All this missing school is helping to drive the highest poverty and incarceration rates in the developed world. So it's worth asking, how'd we get here? In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson created a new federal office accountable to the president, the Office for Civil Rights. Its first task was to desegregate
Why is this buffering like
public schools in the South. But soon, they started noticing that some schools were segregating their students without actually calling it segregation.
A lot of the Black students would be labeled disabled and removed from the mainstream classroom. So they wound up segregated.
Daniel Lowson studies school discipline. For years, he's been sounding the alarm about how much school Black students are missing due to suspensions. The data he uses in his reports comes from the Office for Civil Rights. In the 1970s, they started requiring schools to report how many students they classified as disabled, plus suspensions and expulsions, all broken down by race and gender. Over the next few decades, those numbers went up as more punitive ideas about discipline took hold in American schools. Well, in some schools.
Gangs and drugs have taken over our streets and undermined our...
Slick Willie, one of the co-writers of the 94 crime bill, Slick Willie, and the man who holds the office of the presidency of the United States today. These two co-wrote the 94 crime bill that massively incarcerated our people. And the 3 strikes you're in has New Jersey ties also.
Our schools.
The idea that if you don't, throw the book at kids when they're young for every little thing that they're going to turn into criminals. It's never any reason.
See, they'll throw the book at the children, but they won't teach them a damn thing that's in the book because they don't know how to teach the children. It's a teaching problem. Every student is different. They're not the same. So you're supposed to have a different approach with every student.
Research to show that it actually worked. You never see that in schools serving mostly white kids.
But in 2011, a new report out of Texas started to cast doubt on that approach. The study looked at discipline records for almost 1 million students. It tracked the same kids from 7th grade all the way through high school. The results were stunning. Nearly 60% of students had been suspended or expelled at least once. The study also showed that Black students facing school discipline for the first time tended to get harsher punishments than white students. And the more disciplinary violations a student received, the more likely they were to drop out. Clearly, Texas had a big problem. The question now was if the problem was bigger than Texas. To figure that out, the Obama administration turned to the data set that the Office for Civil Rights had built. That's how they learned this was a nationwide problem.
African American students are over 3 times more likely than their white peers to be suspended or expelled, often for very similar offenses.
They also discovered that the vast majority of suspensions were for behaviors like talking back, using profanity, or violating the dress code.
Nonviolent student behaviors, many of which once meant a phone call home.
The administration started investigating school districts where the numbers were the most damning. One of those districts was Bryan, Texas, home of the discipline tickets. In 2013, a woman named Marjorie Holman filed a complaint after her 12-year-old son was suspended for defending himself from a bully and had to appear in adult criminal court. The Office of Civil Rights opened an investigation in Bryan, along with hundreds of other school districts.
If you can't justify what you're doing and it's having a harmful impact on one group more than others, you have to replace it with something else.
But we don't actually know if those changes made a difference, because the most recent data on the Office of Civil Rights website is from the 2015-2016 school year. The year after that, things started to change.
The 51-50 vote to confirm Betsy DeVos.
The Vice President votes in the affirmative and the nomination is confirmed.
In 2017, the Office of President Trump's new Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, sent a memo to the staff at the Office of Civil Rights. This one super jargony line in the memo signaled a huge shift. OCR will only apply a systemic or class action approach where the individual complaint allegations themselves raise systemic or class-wide issues. Translation: no more looking for patterns in the data. If the office got a complaint like Marjorie Holman's, they would look for one thing: written or verbal proof that an individual teacher or administrator had punished Marjorie's son more harshly because he was Black.
We're not going to question that unless there's the smoking gun of intentional racism.
That's what happened in Bryan, Texas. When Betsy DeVos took office, the investigation into Bryan's schools was close to wrapping up. The final report concluded that Black students were subject to disparate treatment when compared to white students engaged in the same or similar conduct. They had dozens of recommendations for the district: revise their discipline code, hire mentors and social workers, extra training for teachers. DeVos's team scrapped the report and closed the investigation with no finding of wrongdoing and no suggestions for improvement. If you look closely at this clip, you can see Joe Biden standing right behind President Clinton
right
as he signed signs the 1994 crime bill. That bill ushered in new tough-on-crime policies that devastated Black communities. As a senator, Biden played a key role in getting the bill passed.
We have predators on our streets. They are beyond the pale, many of those people.
Predators on our streets. They are beyond the pale. Listen to that language, beyond the pale, coming from a pale man.
And since then, he's had to confront that history.
I haven't always been right. The systematic racism that most of us whites don't like to acknowledge even exists. It's been built into every aspect of our system.
This policy plan comes from the Biden campaign. In the section titled School Discipline, it says that Biden would reinstate Obama's discipline guidelines and would push for every state.
I'm going to move on from the video because for some reason it is buffering
To submit a plan for reducing the use of policies and practices.
We're going to go to how America's justice system is rigged against the poor. I don't know why that video is buffering so much. How America's justice system is rigged against the poor.
I think most Americans believe that after you commit a crime and pay your debt to society, the punishment ends. You have the chance to rebuild your life and get a fresh start. But the reality is much harsher. We punish people with criminal records long after they've paid their debt to society, and we all suffer for it. Even simply being accused of a crime is just the beginning of perpetual punishment. A cycle of legalized discrimination, poverty, and reincarceration, a cycle kept in motion by 47,000 laws and regulations nationwide that restrict critical rights and opportunities. After contact with the criminal justice system, millions of Americans are denied employment and housing, denied college educations, excluded from public benefits, separated from their children, deported despite being legal residents, and deprived of the right to vote. These restrictions trap the poor and people of color in invisible cages that extend far beyond prison walls and criminal courts. Cages that lead to a lifetime of obstacles that undermine even the most earnest efforts at rehabilitation and redemption. Cages that send the message, you will never be a part of society again. This is not some isolated problem. 95% of all incarcerated people will return home at some point. Each year, more than 600,000 people are released from jails and prisons. That's roughly the population of Boston or Seattle. Millions more are completing non-jail sentences like probation, community service, or fines. As reentry specialist at Brooklyn Defender Services, a public defense firm representing 45,000 clients per year, I work on the front lines to help people with criminal histories overcome their past and navigate the obstacles of their present so they can build a sustainable future. I try to help folks take responsibility for their own lives, but it's hard to do when the outlook is so bleak. Even for low-level offenses and misdemeanors, the aftermath of one individual's experience with the criminal justice system ripples out to entire families and neighborhoods and gets passed down from generation to generation. The result, more poverty, more crime, more incarceration. I see Javon, an 18-year-old young man who cannot live with or even visit his family and cannot find an affordable apartment because he was convicted of gun possession and banned from all public housing. I see the dangerous shelters and street corners where he'll sleep. I worry about what he's going to have to do to survive, how long it'll be before he's back behind bars. I see how society loses when Judy, a 58-year-old grandmother charged with a misdemeanor, is fired after her arrest and barred from her lifelong profession as a home health aide. Unable to work, she's faced with eviction and can't support her family. When Malik, a 26-year-old father, is denied the opportunity to further his education because of the mistakes of his past, I think about how he and so many others are set up to fail. How a conviction on a rap sheet is only a snapshot of a moment in time, when all of us are dynamic, changing over time. The criminal justice system disenfranchises these men and women, preventing them from growing, from truly being free. I am among the very few fortunate enough to be living a second chance. 3 decades ago, I was involved in a crime that took the life of another human being. I spent over 24 years in prison for my role in that reprehensible crime. While incarcerated, I had the chance to participate in a pilot program offered to only 15 inmates that allowed me to pursue a formal education. Upon release, I found an employer willing to look beyond my criminal record, one that saw the hard lessons I learned in prison as an asset, not a liability. Affording people a real opportunity to re-enter society isn't just good for individuals and families. It's good for all of us. Meaningful re-entry increases productivity, reduces poverty, and saves money. Most importantly, it makes us safer by eliminating the circumstances that perpetuate cycles of crime and punishment. People already get punished harshly by the system, but they shouldn't receive a second sentence that makes discriminating against them legal for the rest of their lives. By restoring full rights of citizenship to people after they've been through the system, we can start to end this cycle of perpetual punishment. We can start to abolish the justice trap.
Now, corrupt Pennsylvania judge admits for jailing kids for cash kickbacks. This is the gets more
Two
despicable.
Pennsylvania county judges walked solemnly today into U.S. District Court in Scranton. These judges found themselves on the other side of the bench, pleading guilty to a brazen and profitable scheme. Mark Chivarella and Michael Conahan faced fraud and tax charges for allegedly taking $2.6 million in kickbacks for sentencing thousands of juveniles to detention facilities run by 2 privately owned companies. Here's how prosecutors say it worked. Young offenders, often with no prior record, were brought before these judges for charges as minor as stealing change from cars or writing prank notes. The judges shipped them off to private detention facilities, which got county money to house them. In exchange, the judges allegedly received money for each offender. They also received payoffs for the initial construction and operation of these juvenile jails.
Just really scary there.
15-year-old Bernadine Wallace was sentenced to a month in lockup for a threatening note she posted on her MySpace page.
After a while, I was just thinking to myself, I don't deserve this. I don't think that I did that much wrong. I mean, I'm not a criminal.
Civil rights attorneys say thousands may have had their rights violated.
Frequently, there were no lawyers. Frequently, you were told before you were found guilty what the sentence was going to be by the juvenile probation department, and you were whisked away.
You saw the judges come out of court today. What are you feeling?
Angry.
Why?
How do they get to walk out with all these charges? When she went in front of them, she got taken out in shackles.
Attorneys for the judges refuse to comment because a plea agreement has not been finalized. The judges could face at least 7 years in federal prison. Seth Doan, CBS News, Scranton, Pennsylvania.
I forgot how much time they was given, but they was given some significant time for what they did to those children. 28 years, which is still not enough to me. 28 years.
Now, this story has been ongoing. I think first heard about this a couple of years ago when the investigation began. Since 2003, I should say, a Pennsylvania judge, Mark Chivarella, received millions in dollars in bribes for condemning minors to maximum prison sentences in Pennsylvania. In the private prison industry, longer sentences earns the private prisons more money from the states. In one case, Chivarella sentenced a 10-year-old to 2 years in a detention facility for accidentally bottoming out his mother's car. According to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, over 5,000 minors were unjustly sentenced to prison and denied their constitutional rights. Many of them have now been released and cleared of their charges. The court has overturned 4,000 convictions by this guy from 2003 to 2008. He was convicted on 12 counts, including racketeering, money laundering, mail fraud, and tax evasion. Also ordered to repay $1.2 million in restitution, apparently from his illicit gains. He's going to go to jail for nearly 30 years.
He deserves it.
I'd say that's just about right. Maybe I'd tack on another 10, but I don't know how old this guy is. Just unbelievable. And it aside from the obvious corruption here, it also shows a dynamic that is very problematic. When you set up such incentives to send people to prison, you're going to send more people to prison. This is obviously an extreme and naked example of that. But systemically, these incentives work in the same way. One individual may not be getting millions of dollars for extending the sentences of children, but you're creating systems. You're fueling the drug war. You're providing incentive to send people to prison in a way that does not necessarily benefit society at all. This is not to mention the how inefficient these private systems are. They don't save the states any money. Study after study has shown that. All they do is they create a lobbying force that encourages more draconian laws to send more people to prison. We've seen the private prison industry get excited about the idea of deportations and about immigrants, sending undocumented immigrants to prison for extended periods of time. We've seen them promote escalation of the drug war. And you see this incentive structure filter throughout the system. This may be an example, an extreme example, but it's indicative of an incentive structure that we're setting up that is just as corrupt in many ways.
Kids for cash.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our special on Kids for Cash. The shocking story of how thousands of children in Pennsylvania were jailed by two corrupt judges who received kickbacks from the builders and owners of private prison facilities. We return to our conversation with some of the people featured in the new documentary, Kids for Cash. In this segment, we continue speaking with Lorene Transu, whose daughter Hillary was sentenced to juvenile detention for making a MySpace page that mocked her assistant principal. But first, we turn to Sandy Fonzo. Her 17-year-old son, Ed Kenzikowski, was sentenced to 30 days in a juvenile boot camp by Judge Mark Chiavarella. I began by asking Sandy to describe how her son, Ed, first came to be arrested.
Just a regular, normal, happy life we had. And the summer of his senior year, what would have been his senior year, he started, experimenting a little too, and, sneaking out of the house at night. I knew he was drinking. I always, it was just me and him. So when I did have a problem with him, it was always, I'm going to call your dad and your dad's going to come. But now he's,
He was a star wrestler.
Yeah, star wrestler. I mean, the scouts were all looking at him, many opportunities for scholarships. They were watching him since he was in junior high wrestling for high school. He just had a lot before him, a lot of good. He had a girlfriend at the time that was telling me stuff about him experimenting and, just getting a little bit out of control. I would call his dad, and his dad couldn't do anything anymore. He was this big kid, 6'1" and big muscles. He'd lift all the time and not doing anything than any other, than what I did at 17 years old either. But he just had so much to lose. And it got to the point that his dad called one day and said, and Ed wasn't home. You know, he's supposed to be home. He's supposed to be in school. And he found out that he was at an underage drinking party, and he had friends that he graduated with that were cops. So he talked to them, and they were going to go in and put some, you know, paraphernalia on him just to get him caught, get him a slap in the wrist, let him, you know, community service, educational program, anything to let him know what, you know, he has just too much to lose. And this is a senior year. He's wrestled since he was 4 years old. And so that's what happened. They went and got him, and they took him in. He sat to
They planted drug paraphernalia
marijuana
in his
pipe.
truck?
Yes. And so,
a marijuana pipe.
Right. And so, you know, I get the call that he's down at the police station. Juvenile court isn't until Tuesday, so for the weekend he had to stay in jail. Tuesday comes along, and now all along, you know, we're talking to the probation people. We're talking actually to the judge also. There was a sit down in, you know, with these cops and knowing Judge Civarella that this was all, you know, in his best interest, just to get him a little slap on the wrist, wise him up, scare him straight. He's a great kid. He has a great future ahead of him. And yep, we know there's, you know, nothing you have to worry about. We don't need a lawyer. The same story. You got off the elevator and they were there. Do you have a lawyer? No, we were told we don't need one. Okay, sign. And that was it. I don't know. I was just very naive. And I mean, I was never in my wildest dreams would I think these people that are supposed to have, you know, they were the professionals. They have your child's interests at best at heart. And these are the people that you trust, and everything's going to be okay. You know, he's going to learn a little lesson and everything will be fine. And we stood there, and in 30 seconds, he was cuffed and shackled and taken away. And I mean, that was the worst feeling. Seeing him turn and look at me like, you know, what's going on? There was nothing I could do. That's frozen into my psyche for the rest of my life, that look that was on his face. They took him to the PA childcare and said that he would be there until he got this psychological evaluation, which we all know was Judge Conahan's son-in-law, brother-in-law. Yeah, that was doing these psychological evaluations. Well, it was a whole 30
The
days.
other judge who ended up being convicted.
The president judge that made Judge Civarella the juvenile justice judge, yeah. So he sat in there for 30 days, got his psychological evaluation.
Were you able to see him?
Yes, you were allowed on certain days and certain times to go see him and talk to him, and he wanted nothing more. Mom, I know, you know, this was so stupid. I just want to get back. I've missed so much wrestling practice. This is my senior year. All he wanted to do was get back to school. I had letters from the teachers, letters from the judges,
Judge didn't care about that. It was all about that money that they was getting for housing him. That's what it's all about in the first place. They get a certain amount of money per inmate in these private prisons and in the state prisons. They get a certain amount of money. So inmates are a commodity, and it's a shame that they would do this to a senior in high school for doing what young men do.
From the coaches in, you know, lieu of Ed's character of what a great kid he was, sent to the judge's chambers. And anyway, we had to go. So we're going now for 30 days, you know, and I thought to myself, okay, you know, this was good. He sat there, he got his head together, he wants to get back to school, everything's good. Well, we went and stood back in front of that judge, and he was shackled and cuffed and taken to a boot camp out in, it was Northwestern Boot Academy, an hour away from our house. Total military. They couldn't speak. They couldn't do anything. They were dressed in military attire. He was with, you know, people from all over that committed when he would tell me the crimes that were committed, this is who my son was in with. They broke you down. I mean, tore you apart, humiliated you. He wouldn't tell me what happened when he was in there.
How long was he sent to Judge
3
Civarella?
months. He went in there for 3 months. And then from there, because Civarella said he had a drug problem, then he would have to go to Clearbrook, which was, you know,
and I guarantee you, every last one of these institutions was giving him kickbacks for sending that young man there. Yeah, he deserved another 10 years tacked to that 28 years he was sentenced.
Rehabilitation for addictions. By the time my son got there, if he ever did have a problem with drugs or alcohol, he was never treated because they said this kid has spent so much time already, we can't even keep him. So then he was just released and thrown back out. Get back to your life. No school, because they gave him that amount of schooling in there, so he never got to go back to his high school, never got to wrestle. He was a mess when he came out of there. He
lost all chance of
He
scholarship.
wouldn't talk about what happened in there.
How long had he been altogether now in jail?
3,
Prison.
4. He was 1 month there, 3 months there, and like 5 months approximately. But he came out of there a changed person. Like I said, he was a 17-year-old free-spirited boy, and he came out a hardened man that wouldn't even talk about winning. So to this day, I don't know what.
I'm going to end it right here. I want to thank everyone for joining me. I want to thank Big Dog Philly OG, my brother Greedy Vegan, Talk Your Talk Media, A-Not424. Thanks for tapping in. My brother Key Norfolk, my brother Warfare K. Thanks for tapping in. This is your brother Nasir, and this is The Enemy's Public. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment in the comment section. Until next time, peace.
Get your copy of Fire. It's definitely a must-read. If you enjoy hood books, this one is it. Just like the title of the book, it's officially Fire. Get it on Amazon, paperback or Kindle.
The once goal-driven, ambitious Sapphire turns to the street life after the sudden death of her big brother Dre. Dre's best friend Devontae tries to honor his homeboy's last request of looking out for his baby sister. A rebellious Sapphire makes it very difficult for Devontae to carry out his promise.
You're listening to a Fast Bangers production.